ELD with Brainstorm MTG back with some legacy action, this time from Gaming Etc. in Acton, Massachusetts. Talked to Michelle before the tournament, and she gave permission to do a little bit of filming here, so this went out to Twitch Live, and now we're doing some commentary. Mobile setup, so definitely interested to hear any suggestions for improving that. I would love to bring the mobile setup around to the different tournaments that I go to outside of Scholars. Of course, home base is Scholars in Brockton, Massachusetts. I'm there every week. Took a trip out to Gaming Etc. to pick up some standard cards for a player. I do a lot of vending, so if there's ever any cards you need, you can always hit me up at ELD at Brainstorm MTG, and I have you covered. If I don't have it in my inventory, I can get it for you from my wide network of stores. And we have Storm firing off a Preordain, trying to set up most likely future turns, though Storm very explosive, so you never know. Every turn could be your last when you're playing against it, making it one of the most difficult decks to play against in the format. Of course, balancing that out, it is one of the most difficult decks to play. Certainly the type of deck that cannot be said to have been played perfectly very often. So many different lines, and very often no real way of knowing what the best line is going to be. Depends so much on what is in your opponent's hand. So while the games may sometimes feel totally not interactive, especially if your opponent doesn't have a way to actually stop you, the number of cards that exist are really great in terms of cards that you might have to play around. And that, of course, varies from counter magic to instant speed graveyard removal, onboard cards like Chalice of the Void, Blood Moon. I mean, there's so many cards that disrupt and can potentially stop Storm from getting there. And Gitaxian Probe is going to let us know which of those cards we have to play around here. We've got Force of Will, Brainstorm, Ponder, so Force and blue cards. White card down on the end could be a Terminus. Flooded Strand and Arid Mesa rounding that out, so the Miracle player here going to be able to continually make their land drops. And we have an Infernal Tutor here as a setup, so revealing Duress. And we're going to be able to use Duress here to clear the way. Of course, Brainstorm does complicate that. Those Duresses are going to need to make sure that they are fired off in a way that makes it clear when victory is trying to be achieved. You can't just fire off a couple of Duresses and pass the turn when your opponent's holding Brainstorm, because they will be able to hide that with Brainstorm, hide the counter magic if you're not ready to win. So got to be careful there. So many decisions in these type of matchups. For example, if you're going to respond to a Duress to protect the counter magic, there are times where that Brainstorm will just add to a lethal Storm count. Of course, Tendrils of Agony really needs to be fired off for lethal. You're not running it for a life gain spell in general. You really need it to kill your opponent. Empty the Warren's not as necessary for it to be lethal if it takes a couple of turns to attack. That is acceptable, though, versus Miracles, you really want to give as few turns as possible for them to find and Miracle Terminus. They do have the ability to answer a legion of goblins, no matter how large, for only one white mana. Terminus, a card that some people were calling to be banned. Of course, Sensei's Top, the card that got the axe out of the Miracles deck, certainly makes it a lot fairer to play against, as some people would describe it. We do have a Polluted Delta here. Oh, and an Empty the Warren, so lots of possible lines here. So even with Duress, we've got a Search, Terminus, Ponder, Brainstorm. So Terminus, a possibility with Empty the Warrens in hand. We'll see if that's going to be the preferred line to victory. But no, that's the count. The Force of Will is taken. One play that you'll often see me make is getting rid of the blue card instead of the Force of Will when it gets down to a point where your opponent has so few options. That can be the right line, depending on the type of deck that you're playing. In general, if you're going to be able to make a play when the shields are down that puts you way ahead on board, I'll usually rather them have counter magic in hand than a way to dig for the answer to that board presence. And some decisions being made here. Definitely some cards to play around. That Empty the Warren's really not something you want in your hand. We've got a Cabal Ritual. Of course, those Duresses do not have flashback like Cabal Therapy does. Cabal Therapy has tremendous synergy with Empty the Warrens. And it's just going to be an Infernal Tutor here. And that is likely it. Let's see here. So, Lion's Eye Diamond being sacked. It looks like a Tendrils is going to be on the way here. 19, that Force not cast. So that was discarded. So the life totals are correct. And Past in Flames going down to just 3 black. And Cabal Ritual would put that back up to 6. So we definitely have the ability to get to the Tendrils. Just going to be a question of the storm count. We've got an Infernal Tutor. Grabbing a Lion's Eye Diamond. So Infernal there, ramping up mana and adding to the storm. And then there's the other Infernal. So there we go. There's the Tendrils. Shotgun win, which is where you want to be with Storm in general. Ad Nauseam. A card that can go sideways. Of course, it is an extremely powerful card, particularly against control decks that are not putting pressure on your life total. You're happy to attempt to win with it when it's the only option, but if you've got the sure thing, you want to go for it. You don't want to fall in love with Ad Nauseam too much, which is something I do see. It is a lot of fun to be flipping, 10, 20 cards off the top of your deck and just getting them all in your hand. But we've got to remember the goal of the game is to win. Or at least it is when I'm playing. Generally, I'm not willing to take lines that are a little bit more fun if it's going to diminish my chance of winning. Little bit of inner spike for sure. Hope of Ghirapur, a new addition to this list. I've been a fan of Xantid Swarm in the past. Hope is colorless, so you don't have to stretch into green, and it also can stop your opponent from playing spells on their turn. So can be used defensively against a deck like Sneak and Show. If you find out that they don't have a counterspell to stop you, you can still prevent them from winning on their turn with it. They'll be unable to play anything but creature spells. It can leave them stranded with a bunch of cantrips. And of course, they'll get a top deck, but it is certainly better than just straight up losing. And you can see we've got Preordain and Empty the Warrens coming out. So Empty, really not at its best in this matchup. Even if you do all the right things, there's still a chance that they're going to have a top deck Terminus and just blow you out. So better to just attempt to win with Tendrils for the most part, and Hope of Ghirapur likely to help make that happen. That Chain of Vapor basically going to serve as a singleton out to a resolved counterbalance. Other than that, you're just going to have to hope that they are unable to lock you out. Of course, not so much a lock anymore, more of a disruption piece. In the past, comboing with Sensei's Top could actually let them dance the top card up and down with all the different mana costs necessary to completely stop you from getting anything done. As it is, they're generally going to have one bullet to fire there. They can leave a card as a setup for what their best guess is, and then hopefully hold on to a Brainstorm to respond and change it up if necessary. So a far cry from the power level of the past, but still very much a contender. Still a very powerful deck. While we're watching the shuffling here, I'd like to thank Gaming Etc. this time. This was filmed live from Acton at the Gaming Etc. Superstore from their Tuesday Night Legacy series. So they actually do Legacy on Tuesdays and Fridays. Of course, we normally see these videos coming from Scholars Games in Brockton, Massachusetts. We do Wednesday Night Legacy every week at 7:30, and we have weekly Legacy tournaments once a month. And every quarter, we actually do a very large event for really crazy prizes. The past few large events have been for a tabernacle. This Saturday, we will be having a vintage event at Scholars. So if you also play vintage, I'd love to see you down there. It is a great format, a lot of fun. Of course, any format where you can shuffle up Brainstorm, I am interested. That is the type of powerful card that I like to play with. So formats that accept that card, it's generally going to be a power level where I'm going to have some fun. Though Modern getting a little bit closer now that you've got Jace the Mind Sculptor. At least you have a Brainstorm effect. Of course, 4 mana, a heck of a lot more than just that 1 mana, which allows you to smooth out your draws and find answers at instant speed on par with Ancestral Recall. So we got Volcanic Island opening for Storm, for Miracles, Storm cracking a Flooded Strand. A little bit of consideration for Blood Moon in this matchup. It is not particularly good versus Storm. Perhaps at its worst out of all of the multicolored decks, and I guess could actually occasionally even help Storm because the deck does need blue, black, and red, red being the most scarce in the deck. But Hope of Ghirapur hitting here. And we've got a Portent. So Hope is, it looks like, going to be able to hit. So we have a situation where turn 2, the shields could be down. Of course, unlike Xantid Swarm, you do have to sacrifice the Hope of Ghirapur. So it really only does that trick once compared to every turn. And it also needs to deal combat damage, which is very different from Xantid Swarm. Swarm, of course, only needs to attack. Tough to know what they were thinking when they printed the card. Perhaps it was an attempt to shut off your opponent's combat tricks. To a degree, of course, it ended up being a card that really stops a fistful of counters better than perhaps anything else. And then we have a Red Blast stopping a Ponder. So Hope of Ghirapur really not as good as Xantid Swarm so far. Of course, you have to balance out the cost of the card versus the benefit, and been able to fetch out basic islands, making sure Blood Moon is not going to matter at all. And Blood Moon is played quite a bit right now in the format, very often paired with Chalice of the Void, and that is one of the toughest matchups for Storm as well. So building the deck with your worst matchups in mind is generally the wisest course of action. You don't really need to contort to play against some of the decks like Death and Taxes or some of the slower combo decks where you just have a huge natural advantage over them. You really want to try and shore up those difficult matchups, and I think Hope of Ghirapur does a lot of that for Sneak and Show and Miracles. And we've got a fetch. So Portent. Fired off. Looks like we may just have a random card here, unless there's another cantrip. And we do have another cantrip, alright. So, a lot of sculpting going on here. Brainstorm. So we have to think Owen. We have to think the Miracles player. It's actually not Owen. That was my first round opponent. I believe it was Matt that I was playing in this round. Apologies if I got that wrong. We have a Terminus. So going to the bottom. Hope really not doing much this game. It did trade 1-for-1 with the card in Terminus and chipped away 1 point of damage. But he was unable to defend the one spell that was played during his tenure. The shields are down, however, in terms of mana, so cards like Flusterstorm and Red Blast are not going to be able to interact. It's really just Force of Will at this point, so don't want to be too dismissive of Hope of Ghirapur. It did at least create a semi-opening here. And we'll see what happens next. Alright, we've got a fetch. Of course, Storm, one of the most difficult decks to play against here. Anything could happen. And so many of the cards can go from must counters to essentially just worthless bait. It is a really difficult thing. A card like Dark Ritual here could absolutely merit Force of Willing. It could open up a whole floodgate of mana, or it could be the bottleneck that buys you a turn. And here we have Surgical Extraction, Predict, Ponder, and Force of Will. So two very meaningful ways to interact with Storm right now. Of course, the Surgical Extraction can shut off some of the best lines of the deck in Past in Flames. That is your general plan A. And then we've got Duress. So barring a Lotus Petal, this is just going to end up being a defensive turn. You've got to think it's probably going to just grab the Force of Will here, leaving Ponder, Predict, and Surgical. So Miracle's going to be able to rebuild if this game goes too long. You're going to be able to Ponder and Predict and get 3 new cards into hand. There's a fetch land, so still perfect information. Setting up Ponder. Almost. Oh wow, that is unfortunate. Nothing there good enough to keep. Really diminishing the value of that Predict for now. He's going to need some way to set up the top of his library to have it be worthwhile. Generally do not want to fire off Predict blind, getting the +1 card advantage at instant speed, what Predict is all about. But desperate times do call for desperate measures. So no pressure put there by Storm. Up to 5 mana. Still sitting on Predict and Surgical. Still perfect information, building the mana base. And looks like we've got, looks like a Ponder. So this one may stay. It does stay. So Predict is online. So we're going to see a little boost of card advantage here shortly. We've got a Ponder. A lot of pondering in this matchup. On both sides of the board, you really want to be able to set up your draws with everything your opponent is going to be doing in mind. It's a highly interactive matchup. And we've got a Cabal Therapy. So we know Predict is in the hand. We're mostly worried about counter magic. And there we go. So we've got Force, Pyroblast, and Surgical. So Predict being the only blue card in hand, only 4 mana up, so Force of Will unable to be cast. Very interesting opening here. Is going to need to be able to play around both Pyroblast and Surgical, but Force of Will not necessary to play around here. And we've got a Storm of 4. Into what is likely to be a ritual, probably a Cabal Ritual, counting the graveyard. So even with a Surgical, it looks like Cabal Ritual will still have Threshold. Cabal Ritual, just one of the most absolutely powerful cards in the deck. Of course, it does combo beautifully with Ad Nauseam, giving you the 5 mana you need. It is the more powerful ritual of the two. Of course, the 2 mana, a bit of a drawback in some sense, but can also allow you to win games around Chalice at 1, seeing as how it provides so much mana. And there we have the Infernal Tutor, cracking Lion's Eye Diamond. So getting 3 red, looks like possibly going to be looking at a Past in Flames, but is the graveyard good enough? Of course. Oh, it's actually just getting the Tendrils. So there was enough Storm. The red mana not necessary there. So Tendrils, with him at 18, means we didn't need to go any further than the Infernal. So there we go. That was it. So yes, 1 turn with the shields down there spelt the end, and that is a tough matchup. Let me know which deck you actually think is favored in the comments, if you like, and I'd love any feedback on this new video style. I already have some thoughts of my own on how to improve it, but I'd love to hear everyone else's. This has been ELD for Brainstorm MTG. Thanks for watching.